Masculinity influencers online are not really some little subculture anymore. They are a sizable majority, in fact. A study by Movember, that's a leading men's health organization globally, found 60% of American teen boys and young men, so those aged 16 to 25, regularly consume what they call men and masculinity content. You probably know the notorious names, the Andrew Tates of the world, but there are many, many others with millions of followers. They might focus on fitness, and this one might focus on self-improvement, and they hold sway over their young viewers who are looking for guidance. They are essentially handed a map. Where does that map lead? We're getting some important answers today from Dr. Zac Seidler. He's a clinical psychologist and the global director of research at Movember. I asked him to explain this online masculinity phenomenon. Again, we're talking about 2/3 of young men consuming it, and also the findings of that global study called Young Men's Health in a Digital World. Zac Seidler, welcome to All Boy.
Thanks for having me, Chance.
A fascinating topic that you have studied really rigorously and across several continents that a lot of people have been trying to get their heads around. So before we get into the findings, can we talk really quickly? I'm sorry to start on a nerdy subject, methodology. I know you talked to 3,000 or so young men. How'd you do this study?
Yeah, so we started off with a really deep dive qualitative study, talking to like 100 different guys across Australia, the US and UK. We really wanted to look at market differences and if there was actually something going on there. And what we found is that these trends tended to actually cross continents, which was really interesting. So we asked those young guys, 16 to 25, what was going on, what they were watching, how their lives were being shaped by this content. And then we went about and created this really comprehensive survey that we then rolled out across 3,000 guys that was a representative sample in each of those countries. So we made sure that we weren't just targeting a very specific group, because that's what tends to happen when you're dealing with young men and research. It's really difficult to actually reach into those communities who don't tend to show up when you are, offering them a survey. You tend to get the college-educated white guy, and we really wanted to make sure that we were diverse in our approach. And so we got a really nice sample that was mixed in the way in which we were able to look at this phenomena and how it kind of traversed across different groups of guys.
And I hope people watch the entire video that you have on your website because it's compelling, it's insightful, and you kind of see the different phases and life phases that people are in when they start consuming this content, like you said. Now, in the end, you found, on average, 63% of young men regularly engage with masculinity influencers. 63%, so 2 out of 3, and that's regularly consuming this. A lot of people know by now, maybe over the last year or two, Andrew Tate, who's more notorious. I didn't see any other names in here. Who else might people know or they could look up?
I'd rather they don't look them up because there's good reason. We're not trying to amplify some of these voices. And as you can tell, and we had a lot of people asking for the long list of the influencers here, we're not in the business of leading to this algorithmic amplification because we really wanted to separate the findings from the personality, if that makes sense. And Tate has gotten so much airtime recently that I think it's not in our best interest to kind of lean into that anymore. But what's really important here is that, as you said, if we're looking at 63% of young guys who are regularly engaging with this content, the way in which this is spoken about as the manosphere, I'm not sure if you or your listeners have heard of this term, has really separated it into this fringe subculture. It's led to this identification of this group as this strange, in the dark 4chan situation, which is actually, as our research shows, not the reality here. And so it began in many ways as this loose group of ideological, subcultures that are really focused on this thing we like to call the red pill, which is red pill ideology, which is that it's anti-women, misogynistic, sexist, racist rhetoric that is focused on 4 groups, really. That is the incels, which I'm sure you've heard about. There's
involuntarily celibate.
Correct. Exactly. So they've pretty much given up on heterosexual sex at least, and then they have no interest in collaborating with women or otherwise, and it often leads to violent and radicalized rhetoric. And then there's men going their own way, which is again this departure from women, this understanding that feminism has ruined men, and that we need to wake up to the fact that we must live, in spite of and without women in many ways. And then there's men's rights activists, which is a really strong subgroup. And then there is also the pickup artists, which is kind of where lots of this stuff began. The Game is a book that all of my friends had when we were growing up, and it's spread, and so those were the subcultures where this began, and it's now become this on ramp in many ways to a much broader group of content, and that's why we started to talk about it as men's culture and lifestyle rather than talking about it another way.
If you're not wanting to say any of the names, I guess I could say methodologically, I think that you grouped in people who had like 1 to 10 million followers, or maybe they could have more. If you do a Control F, Andrew Tate comes up a lot, but he's in the footnotes. But it seems like some of the other guys, let me just push you a little bit on this. I mean, if a guy's telling you how to make green juice and get good muscles, what's the harm in that?
For sure. That's a great question. So we were really clear on the way in which these guys had to actually be talking about masculine status or ways of being a man. So it had to be filtered through their content, that narrative. Otherwise, they were not grouped in there. So if they're just a gym bro who never spoke about women, about identity, about what it means to be a man and get a job. So the way in which I kind of describe this group is it's get fit, get rich, get ripped, and get a girl. And so that's kind of how it looks. And then overarching all of that is this umbrella of how to be a man today. And I must say that not all of this is toxic content. There is a pipeline, an on-ramp from innocuous content all the way to some of this really problematic stuff.
Okay, so let's really quickly, and I promise everybody, we are going to talk about the findings because they're good. The people who are actually consuming this, though, heaviest users you found, this jumped right out at me. White, older, employed full-time, university educated, and residing in high-income households. That turns everything on its head of the stereotype of some, low income, low education, low employment guy sitting in a basement. So how does that figure?
Well, I think that's just really important when it comes to the narratives that we are being sold around this. There is so much noise in this space around, and opinions that just abound, that have very little actual evidence underpinning them. We are here to shine a light on those young men who are actually, inculcated into this world. And yeah, it turns out that it's not the guys that you would expect. It's not necessarily, the lonely kid in his basement. It is the guy who has a good job, who has good money, who has a relationship.
Get a girl. I guess that's the weird part, is like the guy who can get a girl.
For sure. But that's because they have this idea of like masculine capital. They have something there that they're now trying to hold on to. They're trying to find a way through the world. And they are also in this constant push-pull, success-failure dichotomy that we witness, and I'm sure you felt it as a man. We're constantly feeling like something could be taken away from us at any moment in time. And so really, when you look at lots of these narratives that these influencers are spouting, it is around taking back power, taking dominance, creating wealth. It's all about growth and self-betterment. And so it pulls these guys in who have something to continue to build on, and really creates this resentment narrative in many ways around the fact that if things aren't going as well as you'd hoped, there is someone to blame.
Okay, let's get to the findings, because some of them are a little brighter, some of them a little bleaker. Let's start on the bright side, or maybe benign. I don't know if people will see this as positive or benign. 45% of men who view this content find them entertaining. 43% find these guys motivating. 41% appreciate how influencers make them think. A lot of folks would say, I want my son to think. I want him to be motivated. Or I want my husband, boyfriend, whatever. So those things seem like good things?
Yeah, they are. And I think that the way in which we conceive of this is we didn't want to do an outside-in methodology. We really didn't want to do this like looking through a microscope. Oh, young man, let us, come into your life and see what's happening. We at Movember are really obsessed with lived experience. We're obsessed with men's stories and understanding them with curiosity and openness. And so we are not here to cast aspersions and lay blame at the feet of anybody. We are here to understand what the phenomena are and how we can go about supporting guys' health. And so what this kind of showed is we need to know why, again, lots of opinion around why these young guys are gravitating towards these voices. We've now got hard data showing it is the entertainment, the motivation, the inspiration, that idea that it makes them think. Those are the on-ramps. That's the thing that goes, all right, I'm going to feel better. I'm going to be better if I watch this content. And that's really what they're selling. If you look at many of these podcasters and influencers, you're going to sense that thread throughout much of their narrative. And so that is exciting for us because that is the opportunity where you go, actually, these guys are really seeking something and we can offer them that in healthy ways, because lots of this stuff is somewhat healthy. There is, this beneficial idea around gym and around, there's some really nice dating advice on TikTok. There's plenty of stuff that's kind of good. It just so happens that the algorithm is going to then wash it with crap. It just ends up in this really problematic space where it groups it all together, and the young guy cannot discern the difference.
And we'll talk about what you think should be offered in return or as an alternative here in a minute. But I guess just to get a little deeper on that one point, the Will, he's in the video. I loved hearing his story if people want to check it out. And he says, they offered me a masculinity map. It was go to the gym, get ripped, start a business, get rich, find a girlfriend, create a life. And in a lot of ways, I thought, tale as old as time. I mean, who has not been a young man wanting to I remember being 10 and thinking, all right, these love handles aren't going to lose themselves. I better get in action. Everyone, that kind of does seem to be the map. So what's different in 2025 about that map than it was before, if people hear that?
The map is fine. We've all been teenagers. We're all trying to work out who we are in this world and how we fit in. It just so happens that fear and uncertainty that exists amongst all of us is through technology being weaponized. It is being weaponized for commercial gain. It is being weaponized to push radical ideologies that are fundamentally harmful for social cohesion. And we're witnessing that across the Western world, really, which is this splintering and polarization between young men and young women, young men and older people. Like we are just seeing this absolute fragmentation of our society that is, in many ways coming from this unprecedented access to content. And so the content that is pushing that masculinity map, it begins in many ways with this munificent objective of providing support for a young guy who doesn't know what's going on. It just so happens that there is always an underlying pursuit there from these creators, which is that they are seeking more attention, more eyeballs, more time, more money, and, because followers equals funds. And I think that we need to be clear on the fact that our young men who are seeking that support and role modeling are not getting it in the places and spaces they need it.
Zac, could you say just a little bit more about what it is that they're hearing? Because you're saying they're hearing this really concerning, I don't know, verbiage or messaging, suggestion. Like, what are they actually hearing? Because the Andrew Tates, I think most people, in your study, did not reference him as their primary source of direction and guidance. It was more like physical fitness people. So what are they hearing?
So what I think is really important is that it often starts out with this really good nugget of information, which is what pulls them in. It just so happens to be washed over and over with misogynistic, sexist, racist, homophobic verbiage. And that's kind of what is really interesting here, is that it's kind of secretive. you have to go looking to actually hear some of this stuff in the ways in which, because there's really specific language that exists in these spaces.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, well, I think the ways in which, the language that is spoken about women as the bane of your existence, and the fact that they are the ones to blame for your suffering, like that is a consistent narrative throughout, and it's scapegoating. It's a tale as old as time. It is this notion that you, as a young guy, have to build up this resentment towards an other in order to make sense of the fact that you do not have what your father did or what your grandfather did, and they are to blame because look at their education, their employment. I know you've spoken with Richard Reeves, and obviously there is this discrepancy that is growing between young men and young women, and these influencers are saying they're to blame. They're taking it from you, rather than the fact that there is actually flourishing within you that you can seek out in order to, bring that gap down.
That's interesting what you say about this pulling apart, yes, politically or maybe entertainment. Also that intergenerational elasticity that you used to be able to expect that you're going to earn more than your father did. That is no longer the case. Now it's a coin flip. And so to say this person who you really want to be with also might be the problem, that introduces a lot of diciness into this situation. Can you talk more about what you found on the more negative side? Because there are some things that you might expect, like you saw that these young men who consume this more likely to use testosterone, steroids, diet pills, exercise when you're injured. But also it seems like the attitudinal or the dispositional issues are what concern you more, if I'm hearing you right. What'd you find?
Yeah. So as we just kind of discussed before, there was this sense of motivation and inspiration. And actually, there was another thing, which is that the guys who watched this content were much more likely to be optimistic about their future. They were more likely to be optimistic about their future and the future of other men, which is really interesting. You then bring in those other statistics where actually the sugar high of watching this content, which is saying you can be anything, you can do anything, go out, take it. You're left with this vacuum, this openness, this gaping hole, when none of that actually comes off because you're just sitting, creating, this relationship, this parasocial relationship with influencers who are there to mine your brains and your wallet. What happens is that many of these young guys are left feeling far more distressed than those who do not watch this content. As you said, there's a lot of risk-taking behavior. It might not be surprising, but when 18% of these guys are using steroids, like that is an epidemic. Like that is a serious problem that we are not facing, which is that there are all of these subcultures that exist within this content, and they're pushing really problematic behavior, and they're leaving many of these men feeling extremely anxious about themselves and their lives. And so while you're getting that initial rush of what I can be, who I can be, you're left sitting in your room realizing that that's going to be really hard to pull off, and it makes you feel pretty shit about yourself.
I see. And so then you have that, I don't know if you called it a void or a vacuum. So you're sitting in that emptiness, and it's you either choose I'm the problem or the external is the problem, and they've given you an answer for who the problem is. Is that the idea?
Exactly. And I'm the problem is a very uncomfortable place to be. And so externalizing is a much easier way to go. And that's why we're witnessing, the ways in which this stuff gets weaponized towards violence against others and minorities and marginalized groups.
How do you balance that conversation? Because, for instance, you're a clinical psychologist. Locus of control is a really important part of mental health. And if you feel like, yes, I am motivated and I'm the one who's in control, that can be very powerful and helpful too.
And I think that that's what you're kind of witnessing on social media, is that there's this infighting between content that is saying, get a control of your life. Like, what are you doing? This is your life. This is something that you can control. Look after your friends, look after your relationships and your own well-being for the benefit of society. But that just does not gain as much traction as the scapegoating, resentment, victim mentality narrative, because it's transgressive and it's wrapped with this content that is, just bros and music, and it's we need to learn from this stuff and understand what is it about it that is so appealing to these young guys, when in fact we want that locus of control to be within them, for them to realize that firstly, this pursuit of this perfect masculinity is an unattainable standard that is actually fundamentally harming them. It's so vapid in its approach. It is creating this rigid bind for them that is exhausting and that is untenable and unnecessary. And no one actually wants them to go down that path. But they are witnessing these guys who have Bugattis and who have 9 girlfriends and who are and for some reason that is being perceived as the MO. That's the thing that they want to, strive towards, and they're never going to get there.
I was curious about that as I was reading this and then watching some of the studies and looking more into who is consuming this, because a lot of the men talk about kind of defending their honor as a man and masculinity. A lot of these men do not strike me as stereotypically masculine, and I'm not, so I feel like I could say that. So I didn't know if it's more of are they defending themselves? Are they striving for something? I wasn't quite sure what that was about. I don't know how to say that question.
But it's also like, what is the stereotype anymore? And I find that really
the
interesting.
Marlboro man.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that what we often talk about at Movember is this notion that if you look at Tate or others, if you actually start to open up and fragment the notion of what being a healthy man looks like, he's really rich, he's really ripped. So you've got 2 of those things which seemingly are considered masculine status, and good on you. But if you look at his relationships, if you look at his, he smokes all the time, he's drinking all the time, his internal, it's like you're actually witnessing that if you look across a number of different markers, he's not doing well. And so that's why we're trying to open up this definition of what being a healthy man looks like and say, it's emotional, it's social, it's relational, it's physical, it's mental, it's all of these things. If you look at just 3 markers, for instance, you are going to end up with a really broken idea and a really rigid idea of what being a man today is. And we need to actually amplify some of those voices that look different, that feel different, that talk different, to suggest that stereotype, it's so strange that traditional stereotype is rearing its head again, because it's just not the way to actually flourish as a man.
Do you think it's that odd that it's rearing its head? Because we've kind of moved around this a bit, but we all know what happened over the last 10 years or so. They call it the Great Awakening or what have you. We saw what happened with young men, at least in the U.S. in the last election. They, by and large, do not like this. They also maybe don't want to go back to, to be Ward Cleaver in Leave It to Beaver or something, but they don't like what's happening. They don't like the way they're talked about, this word toxic and things like this. And so how do you balance those things? Because there's something about traditional masculinity or traditional families, or wanting, even if you don't have to provide, to be able to provide, that means a lot to a lot of men. And if 2/3 of young men are consuming this, again, there's something there that is actually the majority.
For sure. So I'm really fine with the idea that certain traditional ideologies and norms, when applied flexibly, like being a protector and provider, they're healthy. They're fine. Go for it. It actually provides a sense of service and altruism and connection for many guys. I have no issue with that. It's when it's applied rigidly, that pressure, that is the thing that is killing men.
Gotcha.
We see that consistently as a psychologist. The suicide research that I do, it is that drive and that box that you create for yourself, and you immediately will become a burden if you cannot live up to that standard. And there are always going to be days or weeks where you can't get there. Exactly. So, yes, the traditional ideology has reared its head for very understandable reasons, which is that men feel disempowered. They feel like they do not have an active role within society, and the modern versus traditional means of what it means to be a man are clashing with one another, and there is confusion. And out of confusion comes insecurity, and out of insecurity comes fear, and that's where we're at.
Which, having this conversation, I just think to who are the men I most admire? They're usually grandpas who have learned wisdom and patience and forbearance and love, and they're to that part of their life where they'll say how they actually feel. And it's funny that if you ask men, who do you really admire? Number 1 through 100 usually would not be an Andrew Tate in real life.
Not at all. It's not. Yeah. That's not the model. This is, and I think that there's been really good examples of this. I think Jimmy Carr said it, the comedian. He said, Andrew Tate is the version of masculinity that a 14-year-old boy thinks it means to be a man. Like that's just, it's a caricature. He's a caricature. And that's why so many young guys tell us consistently that they watch it, and they watch it because it's funny, or it's stupid, or it's entertaining, and it's got that rap of cars and girls, but they leave the misogyny at the door. And I say to them, when you're watching 3 to 6 hours of this stuff a day, I respect your notion of autonomy here, but you are going to struggle to fight that tech.
In church growing up, they always said, garbage in, garbage out. That was my grandpa. He was the pastor. So that's kind of what you're saying. Can we talk about the biggest differences, at least that jumped out to me? Because you compare the heavy consumers versus non-consumers. This statement, men should solve problems on their own. 62% of engaged viewers feel that way. 39% of non-users feel that way. Self-sufficiency, how do you code something like that?
The way in which self-sufficiency is kind of broken down, we had very clear, 4 markers on a Likert scale that were different situations that were taking place, and one went from, I'm very much going to lean on others in times of need, and the most is like I'll never talk to anybody when I'm requiring need. So that type of support seeking, we're not here to lean into those narratives. I think that they're just so overbaked when it comes to guys. And I'm not here to reinforce these stereotypes, but we do want to shine a light on the fact that there are so many young men who are going it alone. And I think, we witnessed in the election in the States recently that this notion of financial insecurity, when you tie that to the protector provider traditions that exist, that's when you end up with that pressure bomb kind of, just sitting there that makes these guys feel like they are alone in this. And that's why they go and seek out online communities that don't make them feel so alone.
Well, and I know that you found most of these people, again, defy the stereotype of who people think are listening and watching to these people. But I remember in Richard Reeves' book that he pointed out the men most likely to subscribe to the idea that you should be able to be a male sole provider for your family are the people least likely to be able to do it financially, education-wise, and employment-wise. So this really is a double bind sometimes, which another difference that jumped out at me, the statement, women should fulfill traditional role as wife and mother. 67% of engaged folks say yes, 43% of non-engaged say yes. Okay.
What we found across the board with the questions around women and feminism is that these statistics were very high across the board, which was, really concerning when you look at this notion that we thought gender equality was a linear trajectory, towards improvement. But it's a roller coaster. There is ups and downs, and there are backlashes. And the aim of this study was to really seek to understand how we can create a narrative whereby men feel like they are the solution, not the problem. And that's something that we haven't solved at the moment.
One more thing. This was similar among groups. Frustrations with dating, pretty similar when you look at not being understood, getting ghosted. So there's some overlap here. But you talk about what replaces that. Does toxic need to be replaced with another word? Because it seems like the word toxic is now toxic. If you want to shut someone down, a man down, say toxic masculinity.
I think that what we need is to call men in, not call them out. And that's why I think that the terms like toxic, I don't think it should be replaced with another word, because you're going to end up with something just as simplistic and potentially problematic. But if we do not, and this is what young men tell us over and over, they do not feel like they have the muscle to be able to engage in these conversations in public around what it means to be a man, for instance, because the risk of being cancelled, of being, called out is so real for them that there's actually no practice ground. And that is really dangerous. And that's why you end up with anonymous trolls online who are just throwing shit out there and seeing what sticks. Rather, what we actually want is young guys trying and testing, and they're kind of like stumbling baby elephants who are like, what am I? What am I saying? How do I go about this? And one thing that lots of young guys tell us in our interviews with them is about the door handle phenomenon, which is that they hold the door open for one woman and she thanks them, and they hold the door open for the next and she slaps him. And they say, what is happening here? What am I supposed to do? It's so great. I'm confused, because one woman said, thank you, the chivalry is great. And another says, I can fucking hold the door myself. And that is what they're walking through at the moment, which, is by no means as severe as domestic and family violence that women are up against. But it is in an age where young guys are trying to dissect who they are and what they can be. That's just a very confusing thing. And they need to talk about that. They need to talk about it with each other and with others and parents and teachers. And there's no place for that at the moment.
Which I told you before we started filming this conversation, a lot of this, these men are now put on pedestals and they have all the answers and they're going to guide you. That used to be called a Boy Scout leader or a pastor, or, I don't know, an older guy at the Moose Lodge. Do we need to get back to some of the other traditional stuff where men were together?
I think that male-only spaces are really important. And I spoke with Richard about this. Actually, there was a Pew Research study that was talking about, and it surveyed lots of women about the fact that male loneliness was so important to them. There was something that they really wanted to solve because, their husbands and their sons were just sitting there and didn't have the social connection that they did. And then you ask them about male-only spaces and whether or not they think it's a good idea. And the vast majority of them said no. And so you've got this disconnect. And there's a reason for that, which is that male-only spaces, historically, have been very dangerous. They have been really problematic. There have been, child sexual abuse cases that have taken place in many of these spaces. And so I think we are in an age of the pendulum swinging back, whereby, the 90s and early 2000s, we've gone, oh, okay, this was not the best environment to have our kids in. And now we're cleaning up. But what needs to take place is we need to rebuild. We need to rebuild with a pro-social, healthy mechanism for young men to be around one another in ways where they can actually do that identity building and be safeguarded at the same time. But to throw out the baby with the bathwater, we're now left with only these online ecosystems that actually have no guardrails. And the really important thing here, Chance, is that many of these young men, and I always say this, these young men do not come in misogynistic. They leave misogynistic. They leave with all of this content kind of offering them a mantra, offering them a doctrine about how to move through the world. They have pro-social values that are being eroded by an algorithm that doesn't give a shit about it. And so that's what I think is really important, is that these values that exist amongst our, the 13-year-old boy that this mother goes, what's happened to him? Where did he go? The light behind his eyes. He has that potential. We need to create environments, online and offline, that are actually going to bolster that for him.
I was going to ask you that because some of this, I think, by necessity will be mediated. Just that is how we live at this point. So some might be in a church, some might be at Boy Scouts, which I think are phenomenal ideas. If you get someone like a Rachel Maddow coming to speak to all the male youths, that's not going to go over so well. I mean, is there an ideal male influencer?
I think that there are lots out there that are actually kind of walking, like, Trevor Noah's doing awesome stuff at the moment. Timothy Chalamet's got a different form of masculinity. It's like there's lots of guys who are kind of talking about what it means to be a man in very different, open ways. They are all
Those
on the left.
people are all on the left, and most young men are no longer on the left.
It's true. It's true. And there are lots of center-right voices, I think, that are important. I think that, the openness of someone like Theo Von, the way in which he'll sit down with Bernie and then he'll sit down with Trump and he'll just bounce around with that openness and curiosity. It's bumbling and it's uncertain, but it's funny and it's, I think that we need to open up that understanding and amplify some of those voices who are not necessarily doing everything right, but are attempting, to speak to an audience in an open way.
I wanted to ask you that because a male-only space, as you said, there need to be some boundaries and parameters. It is not going to be a sewing circle. I mean, boys get rowdy, they get bawdy. They don't want to have to be politically correct at every single moment. You don't want it to cross over into, as you said, misogyny or something hateful. Do we have to be okay with things being a little off color at moments again?
100%. And that's why certain words have reared their head. You're going to witness it in Rogan's podcast and others where certain, terms are just showing up again. Homophobic slurs that are just, suddenly now commonplace. And I think that if we, get our bees in a bonnet and freak out about everything, we're never going to have a constructive conversation. It's like you need to pick your time. And so the way in which I engage in a clinical sense, when I'm sitting across from a young guy who's saying heaps of stuff, that there is a time and a place when you're going to call him out on something and say, hey man, this is what I, think about this and why you probably shouldn't do it. But it's only when the trust and respect is there. Lots of people are doing this policing immediately. It's like red flag everywhere. And I'll tell you what that does, that distances and shames the guy to the point where the very person you wanted to engage is no longer there. And that is the issue for me, which is that you will never make progress if you push that group away instead of calling them in. And then when you have the opportunity, you can teach. That's the opportunity there.
Teach us for a moment if you could, because it's really helpful that you're not only a scholar, but a clinician. If someone sees a young male in their life and thinks, I love this boy, and that boy might be 13, he might be 23, and just wanting to make sure he's okay, and just wanting to make sure he is on the right path, because you don't always know what someone's consuming, but sometimes you can just tell someone's demeanor has changed in some way. What is the best way to approach a young man?
So there are a few things there, Chance. The first thing is that openness and curiosity, which is like, what are you watching? And it's going in non-judgmentally, which is what's really important. It's so easy, and it's important to like witness those feelings within yourself, which are like, oh shit, I want to say something here. This is bad. Yeah. Instead of like biting your tongue and saying, that's interesting. Like, what is it about it? Why do you find that funny? Like what? And just having that open free range, because you'll get to the point where he'll start to move from grunting and muttering to full sentences, and you'll be able to have that conversation with him. I also think that something that parents and teachers do not do enough of is reciprocating that vulnerability, which is that dads do a lot of this where they go, when I was young, blah, 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 but they never talk about themselves in the present form. They never talk about the fact that they are still grappling with their identity now, because we all are. They never talk about the fact that they are probably still anxious in many moments, that they, still consider the way in which to talk about women and girls. They're still constantly in that discussion, and they really want to be able to talk with others about it. I just find it really interesting that guys love this neat bow on a story, which is like, I overcame this and now I am here in a fully actualized form. Exactly. Rather than saying to your young son, I have no fucking idea what's going on, and I'm working this out, and I'd love to work it out with you. I'd love to talk with you about it. I'm watching this stuff. Like tell him what you're doing,
Yes.
Otherwise it's just this notion of you are my project and let me fix you, and he is going to run for the hills.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I did not expect that answer, and I love that because I notice a change in my boys whenever I tell them, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have done that. And suddenly they are more open. Okay, so let's finish on this then. I had all these questions I wanted to ask you about directionality and who chooses to watch this and what does it tell us and, and isolation and stuff. But let's finish on this, because 100 qualitative, sit downs, and then of course all the research. What do people need to know about boys right now?
They need to know, and I think I speak, on behalf of much of the sector here, which is that when we sit down with these young guys, I see hope. I see opportunity. And so from a media perspective, we need a much better narrative here around what is possible. We need to be offering an aspirational, ideology of like where they can go. Because at the moment, that void, as we've spoken about, is being filled with bad actors. And instead, we need to make sure that our front pages are filled with stories of guys doing awesome things, of being good men in many different shapes and sizes. We need to make sure that we lean into the fact that these male teachers and carers, what they're doing, how they're showing up is spoken about. Young men today are struggling with a confusing gray zone, and it is our responsibility as clinicians, as interviewers, as people, just everyday people on the street, to actually wade through that with them, to sit in that messiness of manhood with them and note that there is no perfect way of doing this, that there is the beauty and the beast of masculinity in many ways. It shows up in so many different shapes and sizes, and it is okay for us all to just admit that sometimes we're going to get it wrong, and rather than jump on this cancel culture, we need to find a way to have respectful disagreement, to have different perspectives, but most importantly, to sit in their lives, to sit in their uncertainty and their fear, and find ways to help them solve it alongside them, not above them, but alongside them, and pull them up through that ladder.
Wonderful advice from your lips to, I hope, millions of parents' ears. You at Movember are doing such amazing work to bring a little clarity to that messiness of manhood, which I think you called it. Zac Seidler, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks for having me, Chance.
How do you think about masculinity after this? It's purveyors online, it's young consumers, but also, your real life experience with men and masculinity and how they think about it. They exude it. The data is fascinating, sometimes worrying, but I don't know, to me, the human nuance, each young man's personal experiences and the optimism sometimes at the core of this, it can give you a little hope. How do you approach it? Leave a comment, share your thoughts. I'd love to hear it. Also, follow All Boy on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Substack. The website is allboyallgood.com. I'm Chance Seals. I'll see you soon.